Hey there, Bourbon Real Talk listeners and watchers. Randy Sullivan here, coming to you today with a very exciting topic. We are going to discuss the top 10 whiskey terms that you may hear but may not understand. So, we got a lot to get through, so let's get started. The first term that we're going to discuss is proof. Now, this is a little bit confusing because it has to do with the amount of alcohol that is in this spirit. So on most bottles, it will look like this, where it says what the ABV is, and somewhere on there, it will also say what the proof is. And if you ever notice, the proof is always exactly double what the ABV is. Now, the history of this term is kind of interesting, and it had to do with gunpowder. So one story is that the British soldiers didn't want to drink an alcohol that wasn't strong, and so they would put a little bit of the spirit on some gunpowder, and if the gunpowder still lit on fire, then they knew that the whiskey was strong. But if the alcohol made it so that the gunpowder was no longer flammable, then there was no proof that this whiskey was strong. So that's where, the proof came from. Another story is it had to do with shipping spirits, because you would have spirits in barrels, but you would also have gunpowder being shipped on the same ship. And if the barrels were to break and the spirit were to get in with the gunpowder, they wanted to make sure that the proof was high enough that it didn't ruin the gunpowder. But basically, proof is just a measurement of how much alcohol is in that particular spirit. And many moons ago, the US decided that we were going to make it a 100 proof scale, right? So 50% alcohol, double that, it's 100 proof. That's proof. So we just kind of stuck with that. Interesting tidbit, I think that it has to be 114 proof to make it so that it doesn't ruin gunpowder. So the US association with proof had nothing to do with the origin of the word, but we just decided, hey, if you can prove that it's 100 proof, then you've got yourself some strong whiskey there. Next term that we're going to go over is, it's actually a handful of terms, and they're related to one another. So we're going to count this as one, but it's actually three. So we're going to talk about barrel proof, cask strength, and full proof. So barrel proof and cask strength are actually the same thing. So in the United States, we tend to refer to a vessel that you would store whiskey in for aging as a barrel. And overseas, typically they refer to it as a cask. And when you take the spirit, age it, dump it, and you do not add water to it to make it a particular proof, because most brands have a proof that that's what they bottle that brand at. A barrel proof or a cask strength whiskey means that they didn't add any water to it to change its proof when it came out of the barrel. A full proof sounds like the same thing, like it's the full proof, it's the full amount that it could be coming out of the barrel. But that is actually a little bit of a misnomer. So they add water to whiskey before they cook it, right? And then it gets put in the fermenter, and then the yeast turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and then they distill it. When it comes off the still, typically it's a higher percentage of alcohol, a higher proof than you're allowed to put it in a barrel. So they have to add water a second time. And then typically once they dump it, they are going to add some water to proof it down to whatever that product's proof is. Well, a full proof is a whiskey that after aging has gone up in proof, meaning more water evaporated from that barrel during aging than alcohol did. And so it might have started off at 120 or 125, but now it's gone up some proof points because of evaporation. And a full proof is one where they take one of those barrels and they water it back down to what they call the barrel entry proof. And so the max barrel entry proof for a bourbon in the United States is 125 proof. And so, for instance, a 1792 full proof is 125 proof because they put the spirit in the barrel at the maximum legal limit, and those barrels age, increase in proof, get watered back down, boom, you got a full proof. So barrel proof, cask strength, and full proof. The third term that we're going to discuss are neck pours. So this bottle is almost empty, but when you first open up a bottle, typically it's filled up part of the way through the neck, okay? And there's very low surface area up here as opposed to all this surface area once you start to drink the bottle down and the fill level gets down, right? And so they do that on purpose. It prevents any sort of interaction with the whiskey and whatever's in the air that's in that bottle. But there's this theory out there that whiskey needs to breathe. And there are many people, maybe even the majority of people, that believe that the first pour that comes out of the bottle, which they refer to as a neck pour, and I've seen lots of people throw fits and say, hey, when you tilt the bottle, it's not the whiskey that's in the neck that's coming out first, but whatever. They just mean a pour from the bottle while it's still in the neck, that it doesn't taste as good as a bottle that's been open and is partially empty. Science says that that's not true. The chemical reactions that take place in a whiskey bottle are very slow, but it's still a widely held belief. And so you'll hear someone say, well, I opened the bottle and I didn't like it that much, but it was a neck pour, and when I came back to it, I liked it more later. The fourth term that we're going to discuss is finished. So you'll hear people say that it's a finished rye or a finished bourbon. Let's concentrate on bourbon because that's what I know the most here on Bourbon Real Talk. So whenever you are filing a COLA, a certificate of label approval, and you're telling the government, hey, I'm going to release this new whiskey and I need you to look over how I've labeled it to make sure it's in compliance with the laws, you have to say what class of spirit that is. And there's all these different spirit classes. So a straight bourbon, which is a bourbon that's been aged at least 4 years, it's from one state, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about what all goes into a straight at some other time, is class 101. A regular bourbon, okay, that just follows the rules about bourbon but doesn't qualify for a straight is class 141. But you're not allowed to do anything to affect the flavor of a bourbon by law, okay? So you can't age it in a barrel that's used that had something else in it. You know, the guidelines for making bourbon are very narrow. But there was this guy named Lincoln Henderson who worked for Brown-Forman, and I'm told that he was the brainchild behind Gentleman's Jack. He was very interested in the varied flavors that they could produce in Scotland by using used barrels. So he came up with this idea that he was going to start a whiskey company, and he was going to make bourbon. But after he got done legally making it bourbon, he was going to age it a second time in another barrel. And at the point that you do that, it is no longer bourbon legally, okay? It becomes a distilled spirit specialty class, and that is class 641. But the TTB did rule that if it was at one point a bourbon or a rye or whatever category of spirit it was, and then you finish it and you register it as 641, you're still allowed to say what it was before you finished it, as long as you fully disclose that you finished it. And so you'll see a barrel. Classic example is the company that Lincoln Henderson started, which is Angel's Envy. Angel's Envy does finish all of their barrels. So technically they don't make bourbon from a legal standpoint. They make a distilled spirit specialty class, but it still says that it's a bourbon on the label. Hey there, Bourbon Real Talk listeners and watchers. Randy Sullivan here. Wanted to take a quick break to tell you how you can support the channel. We've had a lot of people that have come into the Bourbon Real Talk family lately, and we're grateful for every one of you. But unlike a lot of other channels, we don't have a Patreon, and I don't allow anyone to sponsor the show. So what I do have, though, is some merchandise. So one of the things that I wanted to show you guys is we have Bourbon Real Talk Glencairns available for sale on our website. And great news, we actually have some wee Glens on their way. So we had wee Glens custom manufactured. They're half the size of a regular Glen, excellent for tasting. On the website, we also have candles, and they're more masculine scents. So this one's like leather, And these candles are manufactured by my daughter's candle company. She wanted to buy her own car, so we helped her start her own business. And she manufactured a line of masculine smelling candles for the Bourbon Real Talk family. The next thing that we have is kind of a little interesting gadget. This is a Glen lanyard. So basically, it goes around your neck like any other lanyard, but it's specifically designed to hold a Glen whiskey glass. And it allows you to go hands-free. So honestly, the first time I saw one of these, I thought it was a silly concept. Then someone gave me one. I used it at a bottle share. It was super efficient, truly made it a more enjoyable experience as I interacted with people. We also have these decorative storage boxes for your whiskey samples. So if you get involved in the whiskey community, you're going to be given samples like this one. And one day you're going to look up and you got little sample bottles sitting all over the place. It doesn't look that good. And so we manufactured these custom storage boxes. Those are available as well. And the creme de la creme of merch for Bourbon Real Talk is the American Whiskey Aroma Kit. So the story on this is I was doing reviews. People kept asking me, how do you learn how to break down the different flavors of a whiskey? And I had learned through a wine aroma kit, but I could not find a bourbon aroma kit that I liked. Most of them came in a cardboard box. The scents didn't always make sense for bourbon. Some of them would say they were for bourbon, but they had scents in there that were really more Scotch focused. And so my wife, who helped with the candle company, helped me curate this box. We crowdsourced the 36 scents that went in this through the whiskey community. And I probably went through about 350 different scents to find these 36. Interesting little tidbit, I've given one of these to the master distiller of a major legacy Kentucky distillery, and he reported back that he loves all the scents and that he uses it to train his sensory team, but I am not allowed to tell you what the distillery is, or it would probably ruin my relationship with them. So, if you saw any of this stuff, you want to support the channel, you can head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick something up. But if you just want to hang out here and learn, I'm totally happy with that as well. Just happy to have you as a listener. So the fifth term that we're going to discuss is sour mash. So you'll see some labels very prominently displayed that their whiskey is a sour mash whiskey. And all this means is that after they get done fermenting the mash and all of the sugar's been spent, the pH level has changed because of the chemical reactions. And they figured out in the early 1800s, I believe the first reference to a recipe using sour mash was in 1818. But in the 1840s, there was a distiller that's kind of the father of modern bourbon named James Crowe, and he popularized the use of this method. So they would take this spent mash, and I think the percentage is about 20%. So they take about 20% of the spent mash and they put it in the fermenter with the new batch that's going in to be fermented. And what they figured out is that the change in the pH level made the yeast happy and it made them better able to consume the sugars, but it also reduced the risk of a bacterial outbreak inside that fermentation. And so it's almost universal. As far as I know, every legacy Kentucky distillery uses a sour mash process. MGPI uses a sour mash process. Only really smaller craft producers that I know of are using the opposite, which is called a sweet mash. And the reason why it's called a sweet mash is when it starts off, it tastes sweeter because the pH level is not so acidic. And when you start off with the spent mash in there, it doesn't taste as sweet in the beginning. So the next term that we're going to discuss, and again, we've got kind of a group of terms. It's head, heart, and tails. So you'll hear people talk about heads and tails. And sometimes you'll hear people say foreshots and feints. So if you've ever heard the term, I can't tell heads nor tails of that. That term is actually a distilling term that kind of broke out into the American lexicon, if you will. And all that it means is, I can't quite figure it out. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. Well, whenever you're making whiskey and you start to distill the distiller's beer that just came off of the fermenter, the first things that boil are the lighter compounds. And there's things like acetone and acetate and things like that that are in the first bit that comes off the still. So if you've ever heard that moonshine can make you go blind, that's why, because those compounds will cause macular degeneration. And moonshiners were notorious alcoholics, and when their still would start spitting out something, they'd want to drink. And so they'd drink the first thing that came off. That is actually poison to humans. It is not potable. You're not supposed to drink it. And that is referred to as heads in the United States. And it is referred to as foreshots, typically over in Scotland. And so heads and foreshots are the same thing. The heart is the part that comes out of the middle of the distillation, and that's all the good ethanol that is potable and we are supposed to drink. And then the tails are all the heavier compounds. And you want some of those in there because it will help with the maturation process and help it develop some fruitier esters and things like that. But in the United States, we call those tails. Overseas, they call those faints. But it has to do with where you make your cuts, because when you're distilling, the first part, you just kind of, you set that aside, and then you want the middle, and then the last part, you set most of that aside as well. And those are called your cuts. And that's where the term, I can't tell the heads nor tails of that comes from, because it means that the distiller couldn't figure out where to make the cuts. The next term that we're going to discuss is bung hole. So I have a little barrel here behind me, and the plug that goes in, and this is a standard size plug from Kentucky. This one's from Bartonville Distillery. So this is a standard size plug. And they're usually made out of a slightly softer wood. I believe this one is poplar. The barrels are going to be oak, and so it's got to be softer so that you can get it out without damaging the barrel. But this little thing is called a bung, and so therefore the hole that is in the barrel is called the bung hole. And it's kind of a funny term because here in the United States it could also be a term that you would use to refer to a butt. So people kind of laugh, but that's why it's called a bung hole. The next term we're going to discuss is toasted versus charred. So again, a little bit of a twofer. So in the US, the regulations state that if you're going to make a bourbon, it has to be stored in a new charred oak container. And charring is basically just burning. So this is a piece of a barrel stave. This is the side view. And this is the front view. So you can see that's just charcoal on there. And what happens is as the whiskey ages, it moves back and forth through that char level, and things get filtered out and things get pulled out of the wood. And there's different levels of char, so you can have a char 1, 2, 3, or 4. There's been some experimentation going up above 4, but it starts to damage the integrity of the barrel and it may be leaky and you may not be able to fix that. But charring typically is done with a very hot fire in a very short period of time. We're talking somewhere around 45, 50 seconds, okay? Toasting, it's like the difference between grilling a steak and smoking a brisket, right? You might smoke a brisket for 8, 10 hours, right? But steak, you're probably only gonna grill for 3 or 4 minutes unless you eat your steak wrong. Charring is like grilling, and toasting is like smoking because it's low and slow. And what it does is you heat the barrel up with a much lower temperature for a much longer period of time, maybe 45 minutes, right? And that breaks down the lignin layer of the wood that keeps the whiskey from penetrating as deep, and it allows the whiskey to penetrate a little bit deeper. It caramelizes what little wood sugars there are inside of this, and it adds a caramelized wood sugar flavor, but it also allows the whiskey to pull more of a compound out because it's able to penetrate better of vanillin, which is where we get our word vanilla from, right? So that's why all bourbons taste like vanilla. There's no reason to even say it in the tasting notes. If it's bourbon, it tastes like vanilla. The next term that we're going to go over, again, a group of terms: single barrel, barrel pick, distiller pick. Okay, so you'll hear somebody say, "Oh, this is a single barrel." Okay, well, a single barrel only means that the distillery, typically distilleries batch barrels, and they'll, a batch might be, 50 barrels, it might be 200, it might be 2,000 for a large distillery in a big production facility. But a single barrel, instead of dumping all of those barrels and improving them, a single barrel, they dump just the one barrel and either bottle it at barrel proof, or they proof just that one barrel and bottle it by itself. The reason why that's interesting is because every barrel creates a slightly different whiskey. Even if the barrels were staves from the same tree and they were made into the same, barrel on the same day by the same cooperage and the same, char level and all that stuff, there's enough variation that it's going to produce a unique spirit. And so single barrels are a way to get a unique expression of a whiskey. A barrel pick is typically a single barrel, but it wasn't just randomly selected by the distillery. Typically a barrel pick, you're going to get 3 to 6 samples. Somebody, hopefully, that has a good palate, tastes all those samples and picks their favorite whiskey, and then they bottle that whiskey as a single barrel, but it's called a pick because somebody picked it. Now there's another thing called a distiller's pick that's become very popular during the pandemic, and that's where it's just like a barrel pick, but instead of them sending the samples out to, say, a liquor store owner or a bar or a restaurant for them to put together a tasting team to taste it, they just have the distiller taste the samples of the barrels and the distiller picks it for you. So in that case, also still a single barrel, but it's been picked specifically for its flavor profile. The next term we're going to go over is NDP, non-distiller producer. And basically what that means is that it's a whiskey brand that is bottling whiskey that they did not make. Okay, so they are a non-distiller, so they're not the distiller of the whiskey, but they are a producer because they're producing bottles. And so this is an excellent example. This is a brand that I was able to launch with my Facebook-based whiskey club, Someone Say Whiskey. And this is non-distiller produced. We purchased this whiskey from MGPI out of Indiana. We bottled it, but it's our label, so we're non-distiller producers. Another word that you'll hear associated with that same subject is sourced. And what that means is that they sourced the whiskey from somebody else and bought it and bottled it themselves. So I hope that this content was useful for you. That was all 10. We're probably going to do a series of these because I crowdsourced these words and I ended up with 30-something terms. And so we'll probably do some more whiskey terms in the future, but I thought these would be fun. If you are new to the channel, I would like to tell you about our channel philosophy. This channel is about bringing people together, okay? We do live in a divided world these days. And years ago, I lost my little brother to suicide in 2014. He was a military vet, and when he came out, he was addicted to painkillers. And, it came as a shock to me and my family. And I don't want people to feel alone the way that he did. I wanted to find a way to help people feel more connected. And I went to a bottle share and I noticed that people kind of connect to one another through whiskey. And so I wanted to use the connective power of whiskey to bring people together. And that's why I started this channel. In the beginning, if you go back and look at some of my older episodes, you'll see me interviewing, people that would maybe not be understood by another group of people. So someone from the LGBTQ community, a Black person about their interaction with law enforcement about, how they feel about Black Lives Matter movement, things like that. Because I was trying to connect people directly. But later I realized, hey, all I have to do is connect people to whiskey, and then whiskey will do the job for me. So now that's the purpose of this channel. So even though there's a lot of division and hatred out there on the internet, and I see a lot of people showing hate towards people that they don't know, I figure that if a stranger can hate someone they've never really even met, it's just as easy for me to love them. So I'm here to tell you that if you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, Just know that I love you, and I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk.